looks like I may have my live guest with me now via Skype. Let's see if we can get Kenya Johnson, prosecutor, with us on the line via Skype. Can you hear us here in New York, Kenya?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, and good timing too. As you know, we just learned there is a verdict. Now, it's so hard to read into these things, but Kenya, what we do know is that jurors deliberated for less than 3 hours in this case. Just about 15 minutes ago, we learned that they had a question. They had wanted to listen again to an audio recording of Kristopher Love from a jailhouse call in which he talks about the murder weapon and says it was stupid. He's upset that he didn't ditch the murder weapon before they found it on him. I know it's like reading tea leaves, but what can we read into the fact that so soon after hearing this audio, literally like minutes, from the time they asked their question, they announced they have a verdict?
As a prosecutor, quick verdicts let us know that we've put forth a great case. That almost means it was a slam dunk, or it can be a sign of extreme failure because the jury acquitted within a short period of time. So for defense attorneys, often the longer they get a jury out, that's a plume in their hat that they at least stumped the jury for a period of time. But those quick verdicts, 3 hours is quick in a murder case. However, it does allude that there was lots of deliberation, not an extreme amount, but that perhaps as soon as the jury got into the jury room, if they did a straw vote, they were already pretty close to whatever their decision was, and it doesn't seem like much persuasion had to happen or much analysis as they reached their final decision for a unanimous verdict.
Kenya, it looks like the jury's coming in, so let's listen in live and see what they have decided. I'll ask you one more question, Kenya, and I know this is not uncommon at all for the defense to not put on a case or call any witnesses, and of course, to not have their defendant testify. But some people might think, often when we watch these trials, well, the defense didn't even call any witnesses. Are they just throwing in the towel? What can we sort of make of the fact that the defense did not call any witnesses, that Kristopher Love himself did not testify?
Well, this is a very fine line for prosecutors because the prosecutors cannot make an inference for someone exercising their constitutional right not to present testimony or offer evidence. And so usually in situations such as this, where the defendant chooses not to put forth any testimony, then the defense's argument is that the state didn't prove their case. And so they're sort of resting on the laurels of what they perceive or what they will attempt to persuade as being some sort of shortcomings by the state. But for a prosecutor, it is a prosecutor's dream to have a defendant to take the stand, because this is an opportunity to trip them up on each and every little fact and just definitely show inconsistencies to the jury. So for some defendants, it is beneficial for them not to say anything and just hope that the state doesn't prove their case.
Well, I think in this case, given the fact that we saw snippets of this interrogation, and over the course of the 20-hour police interrogation of Kristopher Love, he changed his story. He went from never having seen any of these women in his life, both the victim, the woman that was in the car with him, and Brenda Delgado, the woman who allegedly hired him, to admitting that he did have a part in this. So I would think that certainly prosecutors would go hard on him in the cross about him changing his story and so forth.
Absolutely. When you have those type of interrogation videos, it's almost as if the defendant is taking the stand, because you get to see the inconsistent stories. You get to see the demeanor, and you also get to see his excuses and explanations close in time versus a year or so later at the trial, when they've composed themselves, they've gotten their story straight, and they're consistent with their story at that time. So those interrogation videos speak volumes, and once the jury sees those, for a prosecutor, it's almost better, even better, than if the defendant took the stand himself.
Yeah, interesting points there. Thank you, Kenya. Let's listen now, because the judge, oh, no, okay. Hold off 1 second. Let's just review again the possible outcomes here, the charges that Kristopher Love is facing. Of course, he faces charges of capital murder as well as a lesser charge of robbery. All right, breaking news to our viewers. We had some issues with the audio there. You see the defendant is not in the courtroom anymore, but I do want to bring you the verdict in this case, and that is that jurors found Kristopher Love guilty of capital murder and guilty of robbery. They took less than 3 hours to come to this determination, and he has already left the courtroom, as you see. I'm told that the penalty phase of this trial now will proceed on Monday. Kenya Johnson, prosecutor, with us via Skype. So, Kenya, this did happen rather quickly. It was you sort of predicted, given the time of the deliberations, that the jury likely did agree with the prosecution's case here. What can we expect now in this next phase? What comes next in the penalty phase?
So now the penalty phase will involve looking at not only the facts of the crime, but also the defendant's life and what is the appropriate sentencing. And so in this jurisdiction, they may take additional testimony about the defendant's life, including whether he had a troubled life or whether he was a person of good moral character. And then the jury will then subsequently deliberate on whether there should be a death penalty. Oftentimes, there may be a pre-sentencing report looking into his psychological state of mind, how he's been doing in jail up until this point. Several things can come out in this penalty phase as they determine what is the appropriate action. And one thing I want to mention, I wish I had been in the courtroom, because oftentimes when there's a guilty verdict from a jury, you can often sort of tell what the verdict is going to be when all of the deputies begin to come into the courtroom, because the judge takes a look at the verdict first before he reads it aloud, and often indicates to the deputies it's time to get a lot of people in the courtroom. Things may get emotional, but if it's an acquittal, then the judge may not ask for additional people in there. And so that's sometimes a telltale sign as to what the verdict is moments before the official verdict is read.
That's an interesting point, although I would think, depending on the case, that you could have a lot of emotional reaction. And in the case of an acquittal, when you have a lot of the victim's family and friends and so forth, and there's a lot of anger at the defendant. But I imagine they also need to be standing by, you know, to lead him back out immediately of the courtroom. Welcome back to Law&Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat, and we're following breaking news out of Dallas, Texas, where a jury has found Kristopher Love guilty of capital murder in the 2015 shooting death of pediatric dentist Kendra Hatcher. The jury deliberating less than 3 hours before arriving at this guilty verdict. Now, this was all a strange, jilted lover story that started with a woman named Brenda Delgado. Prosecutors allege that Brenda Delgado hired Kristopher Love to kill Kendra Hatcher because Kendra was dating Brenda's ex-boyfriend, Ricardo Penigua, and apparently had not gotten over him. She was jealous and she wanted Kendra Hatcher dead, and so she hired Kristopher Love to shoot and kill Hatcher and make it look like a robbery. And she also hired a woman named Crystal Cortez for $500 to be the getaway driver. Now, Kristopher Love's defense here was that he didn't pull the trigger, that it was Crystal Cortez. But obviously, jurors did not buy that defense, because, as I said, it took them a very short time to find him guilty of murder. The penalty phase for this case will start on Monday, when jurors will decide whether or not he should face death in this tragic killing. I have a guest live with me via Skype right now. Kenya Johnson, thanks for being with us during this time. I want to talk a little bit about the getaway driver and this Crystal Cortez, because she too had faced capital murder, but last week pled guilty to a lesser murder charge and was sentenced to 35 years in jail in exchange for cooperating and testifying against Kristopher Love. As a prosecutor, I would think that's a pretty common deal to make in a case like this, right?
Well, prosecutors often cut deals with some of the conspirators in a crime so that they can make the case stronger against another person. So the mastermind still pled guilty to murder. However, just the death penalty is taken off the table. However, the shooter chose to go to trial, and so he's facing the full brunt of the penalty. Had he decided to cut a deal, it could have gone the other way. The shooter could have cut a deal against the mastermind, or any of the pieces could have been interchanged to make a stronger case against the other. It's almost a two in hand versus one in the bush. And so if you have a person who's willing to plead guilty and to talk, use them to make the other cases even stronger. This brings to mind a very similar case that I was involved with, a murder that I tried, where the getaway driver was offered the opportunity to flip or to turn state's evidence for a reduced charge of 5 years. Wow. It was a woman who was the getaway driver, and she didn't know that it would result in a murder. She refused to take that deal. They all went to trial for murder, and they all got life in prison. And right after the jury gave the verdict and the judge, that same getaway driver defendant asked if she could still have the 5 years. That's always stuck with me, because at that point it was just simply too late. We got the conviction without her help, and so there was no incentive at that point to reduce her sentence, and information came out that she was just as culpable in the crime as the getaway driver, as the shooters were as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a gamble that any defendant takes, I guess. But in that case that you describe, obviously did not work out in that woman's favor. I'm hearing from reporters in the courtroom that as this verdict was read, this guilty verdict was read, Kendra Hatcher's mother became very emotional. She was crying. Apparently she was emotional when she entered, when she learned they had reached a verdict. No surprise here. Now we want to go back and replay some of her testimony in this case, her emotional testimony about her daughter, a woman who she says was interested in helping people. She loved children. That's why she became a pediatric dentist, had moved to the Dallas area because she wanted to help the Hispanic community. Let's listen now to a little bit of Kendra Hatcher's mother's testimony. Well, every parent's worst nightmare being detailed there on the stand by Kendra Hatcher's mother as she describes the fateful phone call she received on the night of September 2nd, 2015, to learn that her daughter, her 35-year-old daughter, had been shot and killed. Very emotional indeed. And Bonnie Jameson, Kendra Hatcher's mother, was crying as the guilty verdict was read in court. We do now have the correct clip of that guilty verdict, so let's go ahead and play it for you so you can hear it for your own ears.
Will the presiding juror rise, please? Sir, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?
It has, Your Honor.
And is your verdict as follows? We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant guilty of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
It is.
And that is the unanimous verdict of the jury.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir, for your deliberations. The good news is that we will be taking the day off tomorrow. We'll resume for the punishment phase at 8:30 in the morning on Monday. If you will please be in my jury room at 8:30 in the morning. And same with counsel. Thank you very much. We're recessed for the day.
Repeat admonishments, Your Honor.
Yes, please recall the admonishments. Please continue to refrain from seeing anything on any media source.
So it was quick, but with that, the jury announced they had found Kristopher Love guilty of murdering Kendra Hatcher. And as you heard the judge say, jurors will take a day off tomorrow. They will come back on Monday for the penalty hearing. Kenya Johnson with me. I know we spoke about it briefly, but just quickly, Kenya, what can we expect in terms of what kind of witnesses we may hear from during the penalty phase?
Sure. So at the penalty phase, we may hear from some of the same witnesses at the trial, but at this time, we're going to go more into the personal life of the defendant. Shall he have the possibility of being released? What some things that may not have been allowed in the evidence portion due to the rules of evidence may be allowed in the penalty portion as it goes in to talk about how they planned this particular heinous act. And his history will be considered, his home life, how he acted before, during, and after the crime, the impact on the family. Almost everything you can think of related to this crime will come out in the penalty phase, as the most important question of any trial will be addressed, whether to give the death penalty.
Right, and of course his attorneys will seek to put witnesses on the stand, perhaps to show a rough childhood, right? We often see that, to show difficulties growing up that may have contributed to him leading the life that he led and making the choices that he did, right?
Absolutely. They're going to want to build sympathy for the jury, from the jury, for this defendant and his life, and that at least his life should be spared, and that a lifetime in prison is sufficient for this crime. Death penalty cases are very tricky. If you look at the history of Texas, Texas has had great success with the death penalty, where the other states may not have had such success. But if they do decide to give the death penalty, that really is the beginning of the entire process. We're looking at 10, 20, even 30 years of appeals before they ever initiate the lethal injection or whatever manner is so decided in Texas. And so while death penalty cases are for your most heinous crimes, it is something that is never handled quickly. It is a large cost to taxpayers, and it is, in the end, even after all the appeals, it might wind up being life in prison.
Right. That is a good point. We know these cases stretch on and on. Kenya, thanks for that. We are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to have more analysis of this guilty verdict in the Kristopher Love case. We'll be talking more about what's ahead, and we'll also be talking about some of the other top crime stories making news. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this quick break. Thanks so much, Anthony. So Kenya Johnson, my guest, joining me live via Skype. Can you see the resemblance there?
A little bit, yes.
It's kind of a funny story, and it's funny that David Schwimmer himself, right, this got back to him, and he goes ahead and films this video in a grocery store, posting it on Twitter and saying to police, I swear, hashtag, it wasn't me, you know, I was in New York. I would think the one thing about this case is it probably would have gotten much less attention were it not for the criminal being a bit of a doppelganger, right, looking a lot like David Schwimmer. So at least perhaps this will lead to some more real leads for police in Liverpool, right?
And David Schwimmer is definitely being a good sport about the whole thing, and it's actually quite amusing. But as you have people and defendants that look like celebrities, this shows that hopefully more people will be on the lookout for this mock celebrity, and they'll get the word out as soon as they find him. So it actually goes to the benefit of the police that the defendant looks like someone that people can identify and recognize. And you best believe any and everyone that looks like that actor is going to receive a tip to the police.
Well, apparently, you know, police in Liverpool say they were bombarded with references to friends and David Schwimmer once they put out this surveillance video, and they said thank you to everyone for your speedy response. We have investigated the matter thoroughly and confirmed David Schwimmer was in America on the date. We're so sorry it has to be this way. So I guess they were joking a little bit, too, in putting out their statement. By the way, important to note that while the suspect is seen with a case of beer, actually, he apparently paid for that beer, but he is wanted for stealing a jacket, wallet, and cell phone from a restaurant in Liverpool. So good luck to authorities there as they look for the real man who did it. I want to go now back to, of course, our big story of the day. That is the guilty verdict we just heard from jurors in Dallas, Texas, who convicted Kristopher Love of capital murder. They deliberated less than 3 hours before arriving at this verdict. Love was the hitman in this murder-for-hire scheme that was orchestrated by a woman named Brenda Delgado. Brenda Delgado herself facing capital murder charges, though not the death penalty, because of an extradition deal that we're going to get into in a moment. I want to go back to some of the highlights from this trial first, though. So let's listen to some of the officers who testified about their investigation and Christopher Love's role in the murder. All right, so that was some more from the detective Eric Barnes on the stand during this trial earlier this week, and we also saw some surveillance video of the vehicles involved in this case. But I want to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, which was that the detective testified that this was one of the most planned cases he has ever seen. This murder scheme that involved a jilted lover, the getaway driver, the gunman. Certainly a story that seems made for the movies or something, right, Kenya Johnson? But I'm wondering, Kenya, you know, what I was alluding to before is obviously this was certainly planned, right? This wasn't like an accidental shooting that just happened spur of the moment. But what do you think about sort of the way it was planned, and was it done sloppy? I mean, we have the fact that this car is clearly on surveillance video. Did these people, you know, consider where the surveillance cameras were? We have the fact that the defendant who was found guilty kept the gun for 30 days, you know, and they found that on him.
Nowadays, any criminal should think that there's surveillance anywhere, even on the street and even in parking garages. Intent, premeditation, planning are all things that will definitely play a part in the penalty phase. We're not talking about a crime of passion or an unintended robbery that went wrong. We're talking about planning to kill, and that is the most intentional act that you can do in the realm of criminal offenses. And so, you know, the fact that there is surveillance photos shows that they were definitely immature, but they attempted to be rather savvy in trying to plan this. But it just goes to show that they missed out on some very, very crucial things, such as getting rid of the murder weapon, right, going a place where there isn't surveillance, making sure that there's no witnesses, making sure that everyone in your group is on the same accord. I mean, I don't want to go into how to get away with murder, but they were certainly inexperienced and certainly not very savvy. Right. However, they attempted to be.
Right. I mean, yeah, How to Get Away with Murder is a TV show, right? But you'd think with all the true crime dramas and all of the mystery television and movie programming out there that people would sort of know the main things that you're supposed to do, at least to cover your tracks in a case like this. And don't forget that Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver, couldn't even get out of the garage on the first try. She went the wrong way and had to turn away 3 times. So
you know, I'll tell you, if it wasn't for stupid and dumb criminals, we wouldn't have half the convictions that we have. People convict themselves, not prosecutors. They convict themselves.
Yeah, well, that certainly is well said. Kenya, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with much more right after this. So there we heard Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver in all of this, who was paid $500 for her role in the murder of Kendra Hatcher, talking about the planning of this, how she and the defendant talked about where they would do it, when they would do it. They had considered doing it somewhere near her place of work. Kenya, I'm just wondering, the fact that there was planning, I mean, does it really matter about all the planning they discussed? You know, we know that they planned it out. They had something they had worked on for weeks. Does it really, you know, matter, or the intricacy to which they discussed this plan?
You know, it goes toward their mens rea, their state of mind. They were intent on doing this and actually discussed different ways. So this was no accident. This was no crime of passion. This was no accidental killing. This was very purposeful. And so that is what's going to come out in the penalty phase, that they were determined, they had a plan, and they were going to do this by any means necessary.
Will we hear from Crystal Cortez again then, you think, describe this planning again?
Usually when you cut a deal with a defendant or a co-conspirator, you can use them as many times as you wish. So very likely we will hear from her again, unless she just clams up because she is opposed to the death penalty. But I would anticipate that even if she chose not to speak in the penalty phase, the transcript from the penalty phase and even the memory from the jury's hearing her in the original trial will be sufficient to show how much and the depths that they went to execute this crime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will be certainly in recent memory for them, as this was a rather quick trial. Kenya, stay with us, and to our viewers, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, much more here on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Welcome back. We're going to take a break from the big trial news we have been following here today, the guilty verdict of Kristopher Love, to talk about another big story that has been making national headlines all day today and yesterday, and that is these crude pipe bombs that have been sent to high-profile individuals all over the country, all to people who appear to be critics of the president. Today, 3 more pipe bombs showed up in mail to former Vice President Joseph Biden in Delaware, another one here in Manhattan to Robert De Niro. There are actually 2 sent to the former vice president, which were intercepted in Delaware. And here in lower Manhattan, the bomb sent to Robert De Niro was also intercepted by his security team before it reached him. Now there have been a total of 10 packages that have showed up all across the country with a similarly crudely built pipe bomb. They all come in similar packages, and now investigators trying to figure out who is sending these. The New York Times reporting the investigation is starting to point towards Florida. They think that a number of these packages, at least, may have come from the Florida area. But I want to bring in Prosecutor Kenya Johnson, who's been with us all afternoon, to ask you about this investigation. Kenya, obviously they're trying to figure out who the person or persons are behind this, but it almost seems like whack-a-mole for investigators and first responders, right? As soon as one shows up, they show up to the scene, clear the scene, get the explosive device out of the way. Moments later or hours later, we're hearing about another one in another state. These have now popped up: New York, Florida, Delaware, California. So how challenging is this when you have this happening all over the country in different jurisdictions?
Clearly a coordinated effort. It places me in the mind of 9/11. After the first tower went down, then you saw the second one, and then you thought, hey, that's not an accident, that's on purpose. And so because so many jurisdictions are involved, we're talking about crossing state lines. So now the feds are involved, and this will likely be a federal prosecution in some district court because so many jurisdictions are involved. We're talking about so much law enforcement coordination as well. Everyone is sharing intelligence. New developments are coming out with every discovery. And so this is certainly a very complicated investigation, an ongoing investigation, and something that many, many resources will be put into because this package can pop up anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. The mayor of New York said both yesterday and today rather adamantly that this is terrorism. These bombs were sent to scare people. Obviously, it will be up to prosecutors to decide whether or not to bring terrorism-related charges. But do you have any sense, once they do find the people responsible, what kind of charges that person or these people may face?
You know, it all depends on how many people are involved. Did it come from one location? Did it come from a group of people sending a package or two from here or there? Was this a conspiracy? What was the motive for sending this? Are these hate crimes? Is this terrorism? What type of political activity are they involved in? So many questions now, which will decide whether we're talking about conspiracy charges, whether we're talking about terrorism charges. So the direction is still very open right now, and at this point they're looking to just stop the bleeding and find the origin of where these packages are coming from, because at any point in time a package can slip through individual security. What if Mr. De Niro's security hadn't caught it and he actually opened it up and it had been a tragedy? So depending upon who it's sent to, there could still be very tragic ramifications. So right now the efforts are focusing on the origin of these packages, who's involved, and let's stop it first, and then going into the reasons why they were sent in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And since you mentioned that, I mean, thank God these have been intercepted. I mean, we know that investigators just trying to figure out whether these were meant to detonate or not. We know authorities in New York were treating these as live devices, but it's not clear. Apparently, they did have some sort of a battery device on them, and although apparently the officials say they were not rigged like a booby-trapped package would to explode right when it was opened. One more question I just want to ask, because of how spread out this is geographically, Kenya, how would they decide eventually what jurisdiction to handle this in?
Well, if it's a federal investigation, they'll likely go with the jurisdiction that we have the best evidence on. You want to position yourself to be able to solve this crime and get a conviction. And so some jurisdictions will have more evidence linking them to the actual assailant or perpetrator more than perhaps another jurisdiction. But this will certainly be a Homeland Security investigation with the FBI, the CIA, all of the federal jurisdictions involved, and then they together will determine what is the best jurisdiction to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Right, right. Again, this could, these packages have showed up in New York, in Delaware, in Florida, in California, and certainly we hope that there are no copycats, because I know in the past when we had the anthrax scare, right, when there are things sent through mail, it seems for weeks after we hear about little false alarms as copycats try to make their mark as well. So hopefully that will not be the case. Kenya, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, much more on the Kristopher Love guilty verdict. Stay with us. So there was the prosecutor delivering some of her closing statement, and as you heard her say, in order to settle on the lesser charge, because Kristopher Love had also faced a robbery charge, and his defense team had alleged that that was all he was guilty of, robbery, not actually pulling the trigger. She said in order to arrive on that robbery charge, you would have to believe his ridiculous story. It's a ridiculous story. And Kenya, you said earlier, look, it's criminals who convict themselves. We have on that interrogation tape, right, that was 20 hours long, but that was edited down into clips for this trial. We have the defendant changing his story then, starting out by saying he knew nothing of this. He had no idea who these women were, and then eventually coming around and saying, yes, he was involved. So I'm wondering, when you have him sort of, changing his story there in his own words, is, what the prosecutor is getting at, how can you believe anything he would say?
Absolutely. It definitely shows a cover-up. It shows deception. It shows that they were trying to figure out their story. And as more and more evidence came out, the story changes. And so it would have been, and it was prudent for the defense attorney to try to exclude that interrogation video. But when all the legalities are in place, such as the defendant didn't request an attorney, or it was done in the presence of an attorney, or if all the checkpoints are resolved to avoid getting the testimony or the interrogation excluded from the trial, as it wasn't admitted, that testimony alone is going to just give volumes of evidence to the jury about how this person did lie, continues to lie, and will continue to lie about this crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that probably did, play a part in jurors' role, in jurors' deliberations, when they sat down to talk about this and whether Kristopher Love, could be believed or could be credible at all. I mean, his attorneys also really sought to discredit the other key witness, the getaway driver in this, who herself took a plea to a lesser charge. But apparently that tactic did not work. In a case like this, where it was not absolutely clear on the tape who fired the gun, do you think that, there was some wiggle room for the defense to prove their story, that it wasn't him?
Well, so there would need to be some evidence to the alternative theory that someone else did the shooting. But in many states, there's a thing called accessory to a crime or party to a crime or some sort of conspiracy charge, where if someone helps before a crime, during a crime, or even after a crime, they can be considered just as guilty as the person that actually committed the crime. And so any part that another person played, they both could have been convicted, even if the defendant was not the trigger man, but he played some part, then he could be still facing the death penalty as he is being the trigger man.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, we didn't hear too much from defense attorneys other than their cross-examinations in this case, because they did not call any witnesses. But, of course, we did hear a closing argument from them this morning. Let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of that now. Kristopher Love's defense attorney there saying in order to convict his client, you would have to believe Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver in this. Well, apparently jurors did believe her story as they found Love guilty of capital murder today. And as we have been telling you, the penalty phase will begin on Monday. Kenya, before we wrap up our discussion for today, we sort of talked about what's ahead in that penalty phase, but you had alluded to this before. This case is far from over, regardless really of what happens Monday because of the appeals process, right?
Absolutely. And so typically in death penalty cases, there is a procedure for automatic appeals if the defendant wants it. But we've heard of cases where the defendant has asked that the death be expedited, and states have fought against that just out of an abundance of caution. And some states have allowed a person to waive their appellate rights and expedite the death penalty.
Right, the process, the execution. Kenya, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We appreciate all of your insight both on this story and, of course, the mail bomb showing up all over the country. So thank you so much, and thank you to our viewers for being with us. Stay tuned because the Daily Debrief with Aaron Keller starting right after this quick break. Thanks so much. Stay with us.